Well, good morning and welcome once again to our online sermon factory at the Rope Factory Church. It's lovely to have you back here with us. And we're continuing our series in Mark's Gospel, coming to the end of chapter 2 and beginning to look at chapter 3. And in our passage today, Mark engages with one of the confusing questions for the early Christian movement. And the question was this: Jesus had fallen out with the main religious leaders, the main religious movements of his day. And in particular, Jesus and the Pharisees had really not seen eye to eye. And I think we often don't realize that the Pharisees were a popular and numerous movement. In some ways, they were a little bit like the evangelicals of their day. They were a grassroots movement. They were people who took the Bible really seriously, and they lived quite distinct, devout lives. And basically, within the Jewish community, they were viewed as godly people. And most of the religious leaders in the community would have been Pharisees, and they would have had significant moral authority within the community. And so here was the confusing thing for the early Christians. You'd assume if someone managed to fall out with all the Pharisees, to fall out with this mainstream, devout religious movement, there must be something a bit wrong with you. There must be something dodgy or strange about you. And so one of the key issues that Mark's Gospel addresses is what happened between Jesus and the Pharisees. What went wrong and whose fault was it? And Mark starts this morning by zooming in on just a small controversy, the beginnings of the disagreement between Jesus and the Pharisees. And it's clearly something that happened early in Jesus' ministry. Mark chapter 2, verse 18. Some people came and asked Jesus, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?" And because we're short of time, I want to focus on the second part of Jesus' answer to this question. Mark chapter 2, verse 21. "No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the new piece will pull away from the old and make the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined." Well, as Jesus often did, he's just using his illustrations from the everyday life of the community around him. He's using a couple of illustrations from the domestic life of ancient Israel. And he's using these illustrations to answer the question, why do your disciples behave differently from the Pharisees? And the point of both these illustrations is that you don't mix old and new things. You don't fix an old garment by using a new one, because apparently because when the new bit shrinks in the wash, it'll ruin the garment, so you don't do that. You don't pour new wine into old wineskins. Again, I don't know much about that. I've never done it, but apparently it will make the old wineskins split, and it'll ruin them. So these are familiar everyday illustrations that Jesus' audience would have understood. And the point of them is Jesus is explaining that it's not God's plan for Jesus, God's new king, this new great authority who's arrived in the world. It's not God's plan that Jesus join hands with the old religious authorities of Israel, the people like the Pharisees. No. God's plan is that the new and the old are not going to mix, they're not going to join hands. And that's not necessarily what you would have expected. And that's why Jesus is not jumping on board with the practices of the Pharisees. Because God's plan is that there be division, separation between them and Jesus, that they reject him and he rejects them. Here's a little illustration that I think you help you understand what's going on. I don't know if you've ever seen a famous old movie. It's a great movie. If you haven't seen it, I'd recommend it. It's called The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. And it's got Richard Burton in it. He's a fantastic old Welsh actor. And it's about a secret agent. He's sent on a mission to East Germany. It takes place in the Cold War. And at first glance, it seems like the mission goes horribly wrong. The secret agent, Richard Burton, gets caught. He gets imprisoned and condemned by the East German authorities. But there's a big twist in the plot, that actually this is all part of the plan, and it's a very clever plan, and it results in the mission being successful. And I think that's what Jesus is telling us about his mission. You know, this apparent disaster in his ministry, where he ends up being rejected and condemned by the religious authorities of his day. Jesus is telling us right at the beginning of his ministry, this is the plan. This is what God wants. And this actually is going to make my mission successful. And look, I think understanding this will help us calm down today, as we sometimes see similar things happening, as we sometimes see secular authorities in Australia opposing biblical Christianity and its values. And sometimes we feel like we're on the receiving end of that. And we can sometimes feel scared or fraught, and we can be quite shrill in our response. Particularly when I think we can particularly feel it from the establishment media, the academic world, if you're involved in that, and even the government can sometimes view biblical Christianity, a Christianity that takes Jesus' words seriously, as a bad thing. And there are accusations against us that Christianity is responsible for human rights abuses against indigenous people or against the lesbian and gay community. And look, when we face accusations like that, opposition like that, I think Jesus says, don't worry, calm down. It wasn't God's plan that his Messiah got on well with the authorities in Jesus' day, with the power brokers, the arbiters of what was right and wrong. They were offended by him. So don't be surprised if Jesus' teaching causes similar problems today. Trust God, it's all going according to plan. This is how God's mission will be successful today as it was in Jesus' day. And what's interesting is, as we read on, Mark records two incidents where we see God's plan beginning to happen just the way he says, just the way he wants. The Pharisees begin to fall out with Jesus. They part company. And both incidents are about the same issue. What exactly were Jewish people like Jesus and the Pharisees allowed to do on the Sabbath, on God's special day of rest? And the first incident Mark tells us about, it happens as Jesus and his disciples are just having their Saturday afternoon stroll through the country. Mark chapter 2, verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" And it seems the Pharisees' concern is that Jesus' disciples were working on the Sabbath, which you were not meant to do. That they were working on the Sabbath by harvesting grain. And you can, even now, you can feel like this feels like a slightly pedantic accusation. And I know personally my response would have been, look, this is recreation, leisure, not work. I remember when I was a kid, I grew up in the countryside in the UK, and we used to go out on walks, and we would pick heads of grain, and we'd eat them, the heads of grain from the corn, along with picking blackberries and hazelnuts. And it was not work, it was play. And that's what I would have said, and it seems pretty obvious. But what's interesting is that that's not Jesus' defense. He takes a very different line. Mark chapter 2, verse 25. Jesus answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and he ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. And I think this is a unique Jesus defense. He is appealing here to royal precedent, which is something you or I probably can't do. He refers to a story in the Bible from 1 Samuel where David, who was God's king, God's anointed Christ, David and his companions were allowed to eat the holy bread from the temple, and normally only the priests were allowed to eat it, but they were allowed to eat it because they were very hungry, and just like David decided it was okay. And Jesus is implying, by sort of quoting this precedent, he's implying, hey, something similar is going on here. God's king, God's anointed Christ is here with his companions. And if David was allowed to do it back then, to feed his companions, then I am allowed to do it today. Behind Jesus' defense is a very clear claim that he is the Christ, God's King. And Jesus concludes his defense by saying, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And this again is an assertion of his authority. The Son of Man is a messianic title. It refers to a figure in Daniel chapter 7 who is the Messiah, God's anointed king. And Jesus is saying to the Pharisees, listen, in disputes about the Sabbath, the Son of Man is Lord. God's Messiah is the ultimate authority about the Sabbath, not you, Pharisees. Again, let me make a comparison. I don't know if you ever watched the comedy show Blackadder. When I was growing up, it was a cult TV show. Forgive me if I'm showing my age. But do you remember, it's Blackadder with Rowan Atkinson. And do you remember in Blackadder, occasionally there would be an argument between Queen Elizabeth I, or Queenie, and Edmund Blackadder. And do you remember how Queenie would resolve any disagreement between them? She'd ask a very simple question. Edmund, who's Queen? And that was the end of the discussion. The point being, I'm the Queen, I'm in charge, the matter is closed. And in some ways, Jesus is using a slightly more grown-up and polite version of that argument. He's saying to the Pharisees, listen, gentlemen, who is the Christ? Who is God's king? I am. And so in disputes about what's right and wrong in the Sabbath, I'm in charge, not you. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, not you. Well, look, I want to press pause here and just think, how does Jesus' claim for kind of ultimate moral authority, how does that play out in Australia today? Because not many of us are involved in controversies about the Sabbath in modern Australia. But it's worth realizing we are involved in all sorts of other controversies about Jesus' moral authority and the moral authority of his teaching. So we need to, even today, we need to remember Jesus' claim here. I'm the king. I'm God's anointed Messiah. And so not only am I Lord of the Sabbath, I am Lord of the family and of marriage. What I say is right and wrong in that area is what's right and wrong. I'm the Lord of gender and sexuality. I'm the Lord of money. I'm the Lord of science. Whatever the issue is, Jesus, God's Son, God's anointed King of the world, exercises ultimate moral authority over it. And so the great act of faith for the Christian is to line yourself up with Jesus and his words, whatever the issue is. And however great the authority might be of our age that is standing against Jesus and his words. And that's one of the ways that we show we believe that Jesus is God's Messiah and God's King. I think the particular point of application where this really bites today is, are you going to hold on to Jesus' teaching about human sexuality and about same-sex marriage? Or are we going to listen to the democratic voice of the whole Australian nation, the government, and the lesbian and gay community? Ultimately, who do you think is the greater moral authority? And Jesus' claim is very clear. I am. He is. Well, as we read on, Mark shows us an incident that demonstrates Jesus' moral authority beyond all doubt in his controversies with the Pharisees about the Sabbath. Let me read to you from Mark chapter 3, verse 1. Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Now, obviously, the Pharisees have decided that it's wrong for Jesus to heal people on the Sabbath, and presumably they thought for some reason that this was another form of work and was therefore wrong. I always think it's a crazy position to take because, you know, it was obviously miraculous that Jesus was before healing people on the Sabbath, which suggests that God thought it was okay. But nonetheless, the Pharisees thought it wasn't. And so Jesus asked them a brilliant question. Mark chapter 3, verse 4. Then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they remained silent. Well, the answer to Jesus' question is obvious, isn't it? You know, it's right on the Sabbath to do good and to save life. And so that's what Jesus goes on to do. Mark chapter 3, verse 5. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. He said to the man, stretch out your hand. And the man stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Here is Jesus doing what's good on the Sabbath. He restored someone's life. And the extraordinary thing is that in response, the Pharisees immediately start trying to destroy someone's life, to kill someone on the Sabbath. Mark 3, verse 6, then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. What you're seeing here is that Jesus' question, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill, was filled with a kind of wonderful prophetic irony. Because that one question and the subsequent actions expose the Pharisees' total hypocrisy as they profess to be concerned about doing what's right on the Sabbath. Well, Jesus was saving people's lives. They're trying to kill people on the Sabbath. Innocent people. Jesus. And Mark's showing us a really important lesson here. I think we're used to, in big public controversies between two great authorities, we're used to there being two sides to the story, and we're used to there rarely being a sort of black and white, right and wrong issue. But usually in the real world, it's a messy mixture of both, and as you look closely at a controversy, you find out that both sides are probably at fault in some way, and both sides have got a point in some way. What Mark's showing us here is it's not like that with Jesus. In his falling out with the religious movement of the Pharisees in his day, Jesus was absolutely and beautifully right. He was the one who was doing good. And the Pharisees were absolutely and horribly wrong. They were the ones doing evil. And this is a principle that applies all the way through Jesus' ministry, and you see it again and again. When it comes to Jesus and his opponents, there's never two sides to the story. Jesus is always right. He's the Son of God. He always does what is good. And therefore, those who oppose and hate Jesus and reject him are always doing what is terribly wrong. And so I want to finish by speaking particularly to people who might be listening to this who may not yet be Christians. And I want to talk a little bit about my own experience. Let me say, I understand where you're coming from if you're not a Christian. I didn't become a Christian until I was about 20. And prior to that, I was really not interested in Jesus. I remember my sister had a brief devout Christian phase in her teenage years. And I was really horrible to her about it. I really didn't like it. And I didn't like evangelical Christians. I didn't know many of them, but the ones I did know I didn't like. I thought they were kind of God botherers. I thought they were boring. You know, they didn't do things that I thought were a very important part of life. They didn't get drunk. They didn't try and sleep with as many people as they could. I thought they were slightly laughable creatures. And here's the shocking thing. Mark is showing me that when I was behaving like that, I was doing evil. I was rejecting Jesus and his moral teaching. I was rejecting Jesus' claims to be the Messiah. I was opposing the one person who is perfectly good, the Son of God. I was laughing at him, his words, his people. And what was so frightening is that I never thought of it in those terms. I just thought I was being normal and doing what everyone else was doing. And here's Mark showing me something really important, lifting the lid off my behavior. He's saying, Tim, you were lining yourself up with the Pharisees, the people who opposed and rejected Jesus. And my question to you, if you're not a Christian, is this: is that who you want to be? Is that who you want to be for the rest of your life? Someone who opposes Jesus and his words, who stands against the Son of God rather than for him? Because when I was 20 years old, I changed my mind. I decided that's not the person I want to be. And let me tell you, that was the best decision I've ever made in my life. Amen.